As I stood frozen in place trying to process what I was seeing, a new sound pierced through the murmur of voices. A low, distant shuffling at first, but then it grew louder from behind us. It was for the inheritance my mother told me that I couldn't have unless I came. His eyes were fixed on the rats. I could see it in him. My body convulsed and I couldn't stop it. I tried to reassure myself of this, but it did little to calm the growing panic in my chest. It was one of them. A child, a Subway 3 child. They were alone, their eyes were wide and bloodshot, their skin pale and filthy, the same ragged clothes as the others. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. They didn't move and neither did I. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place for a split second. The world seemed to hold its breath in an instant. Their eyes widened, their lips curling into something resembling a hiss. Without a word, without hesitation, they bolted, rushing past me with surprising speed. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the realization crashing over me. "Oh, you must be hungry. Supper's almost ready. So, where are you headed?" Frank asked, breaking the silence. I didn't hesitate. This was wrong. I couldn't let anyone know. Dozens of these people stumbling toward the center of the clearing. They were coming from all directions like ants pouring out of their hills, drawn by some instinctual need. Every step felt like a violation. Just as we were about to turn back, I felt something crunch beneath my boot, a sharp, brittle sound that sent a shiver up my spine. I froze, the weight of my foot still pressing down on whatever I had stepped on. Something about them gave me the creeps. They were like mirror images of one another, twins maybe. Frank sat at the head of the table and the children lined either side. Their eyes never left me, watching with the same blank expression as I picked up my fork. At the center of the clearing, standing on a raised platform made of old, broken concrete, was the leader. The man, if he could even be called that, was tall or had been at some point, but now his posture was crooked, hunched over like a vulture. I hoped that this rat wasn't going to be the last thing that I ever saw. Yeah, I figured. No, we do need to find it. I could feel his eyes on me, the man beside me still watching as if waiting for me to flinch, to break, to betray myself. I couldn't let him see it. Couldn't stop my mind from screaming that I was in too deep. I arrived just as the sun began to set, sweaty, exhausted, and thirsty. A sick realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was some kind of feast. I knew that something was about to happen, something horrible, something that I wasn't ready for. I thought for a moment that they might. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that it wasn't good. The other side was more a cow than man, with a long snout-like nose and a single milky eye that seemed to ooze with pus. If we're the first to get that on camera, we'll blow up. They were running back to the clearing to alert the others. While I wasn't keen on the idea of seeing my family, I could definitely use the money. No need to overcomplicate things. Not now. The feeling of nausea and claustrophobia began to take a hold of me. In these dark and winding tunnels, getting turned around would be all too easy, and the last thing that we wanted was to get lost down here. I was just as desperate to know. The crowd erupted in a frenzy. I could feel the tension building inside me, but I gritted my teeth and held onto the rat, walking slowly head down, back towards the edges of the crowd, just like the others had done. With our gear packed and GoPros ready, we made our way to a manhole cover in a quiet corner of the city. Jake 3 pried it open, the metal scraping against concrete with an echoing screech, and we peered down into the black void below. The heads were stitched to ragged cowhide robes that hung off their bodies. The smell inside the barn was unbearable, the smell of rotting meat and dad. I'll never drive through Iowa again. As I sat on the bed, it creaked under my weight. I went to the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what we had seen. What I had experienced down there. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the hum of machinery, a deep growl vibrating through the walls. I stopped in my tracks, holding up a hand to signal to Jake 3. He turned, raising his flashlight in my direction. I could see the question in his eyes before he spoke. "You hear that?" I nodded. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We stood there for a moment, listening. The sound was still distant, but it was undeniable now, a persistent, low roar. My heart started to pick up pace. "Let's keep going," Jake 3 said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think we're getting close to something." I hesitated, but Jake 3 had already started moving forward again. Against my better judgment, I followed him. I waited outside of the manhole for hours, pacing back and forth, staring at the dark hole, hoping that he would appear out of it, safe and sound. But Jake 3 was already shaking his head, his eyes wide, his excitement slowly turning to obsession. The stench of decay still clung to the air, mixing with the sickly metallic tang of blood. My heart raced, pounding in my ears almost louder than the cacophony of noise behind me. It was like my insides were churning, as if they wanted to escape my body entirely. The horror of what I had just done, what I had been forced to do, the horror of what I had just done, what I had been forced to do, felt like it was coming out of me in waves. Whatever did this, they cut these off clean. A person did this. Panic surged through me, and in that split second, I turned and ran, heart pounding in my ears. It looked grotesque, a twisted mockery of something royal. He's probably already halfway back to the surface. They covered it up and acted like it had never happened. The voices of the subway, 3 people mingling with the chorus of strange guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. My heart started pounding and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The smell had been bad from the start, but now it was clawing its way into my head, thick and unrelenting. Every breath felt like I was swallowing damp rot mixed with decay, the odor sinking into my lungs. The last thing that I wanted was to be discovered as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. I couldn't risk it, and so with shaking hands I bent down and I grabbed a rat. It was cold and stiff beneath my fingers, its fur matted and slick with felt. The weight of it was almost comical at first, like I was holding something that didn't belong in my hands, but I held onto it tightly. It was almost comical at first, like I was holding something that didn't belong in my hands. The realization hit me like a blow to the gut. As we ventured deeper into the tunnels, I couldn't help but notice the appearance of the subway 3 began to change. The walls were slick with grime and patches of mildew growing along the cracked cement. The house was stifling, the air thick and oppressive. Yeah, you're probably right. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. And then they turned and retreated back to the edges of the clearing, crouching down to wait patiently. It was a huge, mountainous pile. I could hear them behind me. "Oh, that's a long way. You're welcome to join us," he said, his voice steady but with a fire beneath it. The tape whizzed by, just a blur of orange as I sped past it, barely able to keep track of where I was. They reached the barn and one by one they disappeared inside. Abandoned buildings, forgotten hotels, that was our brand. The bell above jingled weakly, barely audible. I hesitated. My hands scrambled for the ladder as I hauled myself up, every muscle in my body screaming, but I didn't care. Freedom was right there just above me. I could sense their gaze following me as I walked past, the oppressive weight of their attention pressing down on me, but I didn't look up. Weight of their attention pressing down on me, but I didn't look up. For a moment I believed them and felt a feeling of relief, but as I left the police station that day, deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a huge mistake. This was real and we were standing in the middle of it. "No, we need to go further." They covered it up and acted like it had never happened. Jake 3 was reported missing, but they chalked it up to him just running away, maybe with a girl or something. I had succeeded. With everyone preoccupied with their meal, I decided now was my chance to escape. The first thing that I did when I stumbled out into the light was vomit. Crouching low, I made my way through the crowd, toward the tunnel which we had come. As we pressed on, the sound grew louder and we realized something unsettling. This isn't just some random mess. I fumbled with the ignition, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life just as I heard the sound of footsteps gaining on me. I glanced over at Jake 3, but he was still focused on the trail of redheads, his flashlight sweeping back and forth. "Hey, we've seen enough, no video's worth all of this." I felt my pulse quicken, a wave of nausea rising in my throat as I stared at the trail of severed heads. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to get out of here before whatever had left us realized that we were here. Their limbs moved with jerky, unnatural motions like they didn't fully understand how to walk properly anymore. They moved with urgency and with purpose, but at the same time there was a strange disjointedness to their movements. It was unsettling in a way that I couldn't explain. Urban exploring in New York City had been our thing for years, and YouTube was just a way to share it. The two other, younger adults, John and Mary, stood by the door, watching me without a word. I stopped dead in my tracks. A rusty sign that read, "Harper's Fuel and Goods," hung above the single-weathered fuel pump out front. A faint buzzing noise came from the flickering open neon light in the window. All right, yeah, let's go," he finally replied. He raised his hands slowly, and in that moment, the entire crowd fell silent. But in the back of my mind, that question still echoed. For a while, this routine was all that we had, exploring the narrow tunnels, stepping around filth and cockroaches, chatting to our cameras, cracking jokes to amass the tension. The sound that followed was like nothing that I had ever heard before, like the gnashing of wild animals tearing at fresh meat, the sound of skin being shredded and bones cracking under the weight of a savage hunger. Skin being shredded and bones cracking under the weight of a savage hunger. They took the GoPro and assured me that they would take care of it. I tried to relax, but something about the house felt off. The way the family had stared at me all throughout dinner, the strange, almost robotic way they moved, it was all too much. "You don't talk much, do ya?" Frank asked, his grin widening. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but hey, it was home, far better than the empty road behind me. I knew that he was fumbling inside his brain, trying to decide if we had gotten enough footage for a video. Something about seeing something so horrifying and twisted made the inheritance feel irrelevant. Her grip was firm and her skin felt rough and calloused in a way that spoke of years of hard labor. Frank's truck was old and rusted, the engine loud as we rattled down a dirt road. The king, as I started to think of him, raised his hand again, a slow deliberate motion that commanded the crowd. Jake 3 and I spent hours prepping for the Subway 3 dive, making sure that we had everything we would need to face whatever was down there. It hit me all at once, violent and uncontrollable. My stomach twisted, and before I could even catch my breath, the black, disgusting bile came up. Every night I'd dream of that thing appearing in my room and dragging me back to that barn. I tried to push back to fight my way free, but the crowd was too strong and too dense. Their eyes were unblinking and their lips were thin. The children, Billy and Ruth, were even more unsettling. We both stood there, speechless. The manhole cover was still off. "Hey Jake 3, I think it's time we get the hell out of here," I said. Jake 3 paused a moment, considering what I had said. I didn't want to know who or what would do that. Of course, there was none. We spoke in low voices, our words bouncing off the walls and echoing down the tunnels. Every so often we would hear scuttling and faint splashes of water, but nothing more. I tried to block out the sounds, the images, tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, but no matter how tightly I shut my eyes, these sounds wouldn't stop. I locked my car and I started walking. I didn't look back. I backed away, my breathing coming in ragged gasps, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature's milky eye rolled in its socket, and for a moment, it seemed to lock onto me. Their features were distorted, with wide gap-toothed smiles and crooked eyes, and heads that seemed too large for their small bodies. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all blending together in a constant, unintelligible hum. I couldn't let anyone see it. His face was covered in grime, his teeth stained with dark red, but it was the expression in his eyes that froze me. "Oh, gross, what the hell?" I muttered, lifting my foot carefully and instinctively, shining my flashlight downward. Something more, and then my eyes locked onto something that made my breath catch. I kept chewing even though I wanted to vomit, even though I wanted to scream, even though I wanted to scream. The crowd around me was consumed by their own feeding frenzy, ripping, tearing, devouring the rats with an almost animalistic fervor. The sound of gnashing teeth and guttural growls filled the air, drowning out everything else. When I glanced back toward the man, he wasn't watching me anymore. We weren't just watching anymore. "Yeah, thanks, I appreciate it." Jake 3 was reported missing, but they chalked it back to me. And yet I had just done the same thing that they had. A whole network of people living under the city. It felt like something that we weren't supposed to see. "Well, you'll sleep good tonight." His eyes flicked from person to person, and as if on cue, the crowd began to shuffle forward, toward the massive pile of rats in the center of the clearing. I lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling in for the night. It was as if this was all normal. Sue smiled warmly as I approached, wiping her hands on a faded apron. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I looked around. The people were all staring now, some with wide, hungry eyes. Figures were emerging from the dark tunnels behind us, their silhouettes barely visible. Chatter, laughter, some raised voices, all of it happening at once. This is the real deal. But as our adventure 3 grew, so did the demands of our audience. I told Jake 3 as much. "I gotta say, man, I'm starting to think this stuff about Subway 3 people is just bullshit." One by one, people stepped forward, bent down, and grabbed rats from the pile. They didn't hesitate, their hands trembling as they selected their prize, some ripping the poor creatures free from the heap like they were choosing cuts of meat at a butcher's stall. Others limped as they shuffled around the clearing. The meat was dark and almost black in places, and the potatoes were watery, pooling at the bottom of the plate. There was something strange about their faces, a certain dullness to their expressions. He didn't say anything, but I saw the way his flashlight flickered over the walls, a growing unease creeping into his expression. Shelves lined with old cans of beans, dusty bottles of water, and a few bags of chips. "We're in over our heads here, man. No signs of human life." I drove until the first signs of civilization appeared on the horizon, until I found a diner where I could stop and breathe. I never went to my father's funeral. The bedroom they offered me was small, just a single bed with an old sagging mattress, a nightstand, and a dresser. The window overlooked the cornfield, stretching out endlessly into the night. Every instinct told me not to follow, but something stronger, some morbid curiosity, pushed me to find out what they were doing in there. I slipped out of the room, moving quietly down the stairs and out the front door. The smell of cooked meat filled the air, mingling with the smell of mold. And there were dozens of them, arranged in a long trail leading deeper into the Subway 3, like some type of twisted bread trail. Jake 3's light joined mine, and I heard his sharp intake of breath as he took in the scene. The inside was dimly lit. At first, there were just a few, but then it turned into a flood. I felt hands brush against my arms, cold and clammy. And then, with a guttural and broken voice that seemed to scrape against the very air itself, the king bellowed, "Eat." I ran blindly through the dark, my feet pounding against the dirt path as I sprinted back toward the house. I heard the sound of the barn doors swinging open and the family yelling after me. Jake 3 shot me a quick look, a mix of excitement and nervousness on his face. I almost gagged at the thought of it, but I pushed it down and forced myself to swallow my pride and my fear. The overwhelming stench of the rats, the blood, and the decay was fading with every step that I took away from the nightmare. Gripping the rusty metal as we descended into the underbelly of the city. It was all so surreal. Jesus Christ, it's real. The house was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper and old wooden furniture. A low murmur like a chorus, layered and overlapping. This thing was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of man and cow. We were no longer in the decaying, forgotten part of the Subway 3 system, but in some other area, one that looked cared for and used. One that looked cared for and used. The rungs were barely visible on the faint light, but I could make them out just enough. I shoved myself toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed hold, yanking myself upward. You. I tried to sound casual, but something about the place made me uneasy. I made a beeline for the truck parked in the yard, yanking open the door and praying that the keys were still inside. We had joined it. I could see daylight streaming through the opening. The closer we got, the more it became like a crowd. The way a school lunchroom sounds when you're standing in the hallway. They were piled high in the center with the leader overseeing the rat feast like some kind of grotesque ritual. Any chance you know of any motels or somebody that could tow me? His lips pulled into a slow and thin smile. Somewhere in the dark, we heard a faint scuttle, the unmistakable skitter of rats just out of sight. Among the gear, I had packed several rolls of reflective tape. The guttural sounds of gnawing and tearing filled the air, mingling with the sickeningly wet squelch of flesh being ripped apart. The gas station, like most things around here, seemed stuck in time. I was traveling through the middle of nowhere, Iowa when it happened. The kids were still watching me, their eyes unnervingly wide, their heads bobbing slightly with every bite they took. The farm came into view, a white, weathered house surrounded by a couple of barns and a silo. It looked like the kind of place that time had forgotten, untouched by anything modern. I barely had time to brace myself before it came again. They were something else, something more. And then my eyes locked onto something that made my breath catch. The smell, while still overwhelmingly foul, had begun to change in subtle ways, less stagnant. My chest tightened, breasts coming in shallower, and the concrete felt like it was pressing down on me. When I reached the house, I didn't bother with the door. Behind the counter sat an old man as thin as a scarecrow, his skin weathered. "Eat up," Sue said, settling down across from me. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to swallow to pretend that it didn't make me sick. Some of them shuffled and some of them crawled, and others had just seemed to drag their limbs along like they hadn't walked in years. The stench grew stronger as they piled in. No movement. A detective brought me into a room and watched the footage on my camera. I focused on the tape, the reflective strips that I had laid down earlier, each piece glinting faintly as I passed. But he never did. Ain't nothing out here but peace and quiet. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. I hadn't seen another car or a sign of life for miles. I tried to find Jake 3 in the crowd, but he was nowhere to be seen. In a moment of internal conflict, I tried to decide whether to stay and look for him or whether to leave. Nearest town's quite a ways off. Think about it. Its legs were bent and twisted, ending in hooves, but its torso was humanoid, muscular and covered in patches of matted fur. Its arms were long, too long, with fingers that ended in a sharp black in nails, but its head was the most horrifying part. Places. I couldn't afford to. I could hear their breathing, it was heavy and labored, licking cold with grime. As the bodies poured in from behind us, the next thing I knew we were being shoved forward, pushed into the heart of the crowd. The smell was suffocating now and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the noise grew louder. I convinced myself. I glanced around at the others, at the people who had already taken their rats, and saw that no one was looking at me. We packed our bags with essentials, extra water, enough to last us a few hours and spare batteries for the flashlights, since darkness would be our worst enemy. I grabbed a few granola bars too just in case we got stuck down there longer than planned. It was what stood in the center of the altar. There were thousands of them, more than I could ever count. And then to make it worse, they threatened to arrest me for trespassing if I didn't leave the station immediately. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I made my way toward the barn, and the smell of something else and decay got stronger with every step closer to the barn. When I reached the barn, the doors were slightly ajar, just enough for me to peer inside. What I saw stopped my heart. The family stood in a circle around a crude wooden altar. Each of them wore the head of a cow, real cow heads and not masks. The flesh was rotting and the eyes were hollowed out, leaving only dark, gaping holes for them to peer out of. The scent of decay hit me first, the stench of rot, of death. A faint smell of something else joined us, a dead smell, something like sulfur. An older woman, 2 young adults, and 2 younger children standing on the steps. They stood perfectly still watching the truck approach. I knew that I had done it. We were far away from our exit now, from fresh air, from daylight, and the reality of how deep we had ventured hit me. I wanted to turn around, to trace our way back to the manhole and climb out into the open air. I couldn't tear my eyes away even though I wanted to, even though every part of me screamed to run. The only thing that mattered to me was getting back to the surface. I didn't look back. I glanced at Jake 3, who seemed focused, oblivious to my growing panic. I started to feel like the walls of the subway 3 were inching closer, getting tighter around us. The field stretched out on either side, the setting sun casting long shadows over the corn stalks. And I couldn't deny it. You'll need your strength for a trip like that. The stench hit us first, a mix of mold and filth. I forced myself to take another breath, hoping that it would steady me, but all it did was fill my lungs with that choking and nauseating stench. In my mind, I was thinking this place looked just like the kind of gas station in horror movies, just before the main character is being chased by a group of inbred killers. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. The rats, still limp in their hands, were immediately ripped open. Jake 3 didn't respond right away, he just kept looking at the heads, and then finally he turned to me, his eyes intense. These weren't homeless people or squatters living down here. In the center, they were surrounding a massive pile of rats. Flesh was torn away and grayed in savage chunks, and fur flew everywhere in the dim flickering light of the flashlights. "Oh, sorry, I'm just tired," I muttered, glancing around the table. I had no choice, I had to blend in. We don't need the video that bad. It was a heavy smell and it made my stomach churn. The sounds of the street above faded with each stop, replaced by the steady movement of water echoing around us in the hum of distant machinery. When our feet hit the wet concrete below, we stood there in the dim beam of our flashlight, our eyes adjusting to the darkness. "Well, I guess this is it," he said before turning on his GoPro. He shot me a grin before he went down first, his flashlight beam slicing into the darkness. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of eyes that were too wide and too bright, like they had been adapted to the darkness. "We didn't belong here, no normal person does," they muttered and grunted to each other. Their speech broken and garbled, the few words that escaped their lips sounded like a twisted form of English, nothing coherent, just guttural sounds. My Chevy began to sputter and my engine light began to blink. His face flushed with something that I couldn't place. He said one night, eyes gleaming. Still, I forced a polite smile. Someone. But I had no choice but to wait. I sat there in the filthy, rat-infested subway 3, surrounded by hundreds of people who were no longer people. I turned and bolted. It let out a low guttural sound, a mixture of a moo and a scream that vibrated through the air. I recalled seeing a rundown gas station a couple of miles back and decided making the walk was my only option. It was part human, part cow, its face distorted and deformed. One side was mostly human with a bulging eye and a misshapen mouth that hung open, revealing rows of jagged and yellow teeth. I looked over at Jake 3, but his expression was distant. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, my hands clenching around the rat, my mind begging me to run. Voices, grunts, the sound of tearing, gnashing teeth. I nodded, taking a tentative bite. My lungs were on fire, each breath coming in sharp and desperate gasps. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I did not stop running. I shivered involuntarily. Ain't much for a signal out here. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop the panic from creeping in. He was tearing into his own rat. Unnervingly wide, their heads bobbing slightly with every bite they took. The longer that I sat there, the more that I felt the walls closing in around me. That I was surrounded by people who were no longer human. He was an adult after all. We'll push a little bit further and then we'll head back, Jake 3 replied. To keep any Subway 3 pests at bay, we duct-taped our pant legs and sleeves, sealing off every gap to make sure that nothing small and unwelcome could find its way in. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins, but I didn't stop. I couldn't let them see that I was different, that I was scared, that I didn't belong here. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to move, my body stiff and rigid as I made my way through the crowd. Hundreds of them, maybe more. My heart skipped a beat. We've been talking about this for months and now we have proof, man. I turned, my heart leaping in my chest. This is exactly why we're here. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The wind rustled the corn, an occasional gust carrying with it a thick earthy scent. Drive there, get in, get out. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't madness, it was curiosity. A chill ran down my spine and I knew then that he was studying me, trying to figure out if I was one of them, if I was a part of the feast. I couldn't stop. Their eyes were wide open, frozen in a permanent state of terror, their little bodies twisted and mangled. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I imagined the horror of whatever had made them like this, but the people around me were all so calm, so unbothered by it. The deeper we went, I started to notice something. Curiosity, obsession. I could feel the eyes of the Subway 3 people on me. Shit, I said. My feet stumbling as I was pushed further into the group. The footage, the evidence, it was all gone. I could feel it choking me, making me gag as my stomach heaved. I couldn't deny the city. The bed was uncomfortable, but exhaustion started to creep in. I started to wonder if the stories about these Subway 3 people were just nothing more than rumors. But like most urban legends, I assumed the stories were exaggerated. It wasn't a roar at all. If we're the first to get that on camera, we'll blow up. Picked a rat from the pile just like them. Every few yards, I peeled off a strip and slapped it on the wall, watching as it shined in the beam of our flashlights like a tiny beacon marking our way back. It felt reassuring, each piece of tape reflecting back to us, a reminder that we had a trail back to the exit, no matter how far in we ventured. Finally, I saw the ladder. The crown was perched unevenly on his black, oily matted hair, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he surveyed the crowd. His expression calm, like he was the ruler of this entire underground kingdom. My heart pounded in my chest. As we pulled up, the porch light flickered on and I saw them. Shit, I muttered to myself stepping out of the car. I couldn't risk it. Without thinking, without even acknowledging what I was doing, I leaned down and brought the rat up to my mouth. This was no longer just some urban legend. Crouching low, I made my way through the crowd, toward the tunnel which we had come. But none of it mattered now. I sat glancing around the store. Its lips curled into something that resembled a smile, revealing more of those sharp and rotten teeth. One rung at a time, I followed him, my hands gripping the rusty metal as we descended into the underbelly of the city. Every step felt like it could be my last, but I didn't stop. I moved swiftly, but as quietly as possible, my hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight. I wasn't very close with my father and it wasn't out of the need of closure, no. My flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I was shoved again, deeper into the center of the clearing. People, things, limbs were bumping against me, pressing in from all sides, their skin slick and cold with grime. I gagged, pulling my shirt over my nose in a useless attempt to filter the air, but it barely helped. I cursed and I flicked on the emergency lights and I coasted onto the shoulder. Funeral, I said, out in Ohio, just passing through. My car coming to rest with a final pathetic cough. Grabbing my phone, I checked for service. I could taste the filth in the rat's skin, the decay that clung to its bones. Plates were already set and Sue wasted no time in serving up slabs of meat and mashed potatoes. The food looked hearty enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The outside world and safety was just a few feet away. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine now, the air pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't know what I expected to find down here, but it was not this. Jake 3's eyes darted around scanning the walls and the tunnel ahead. The rancid, sour smell of bodies and decay thickened in the air, mixing with the overpowering scent of rats. With a deep breath, I turned away from the crowd, my legs barely holding me as I crept back toward the tunnel. They took the GoPro and assured me that they might. A detective brought me into a room and watched the footage on my camera. This wasn't what I had expected to find when we had started this. I had to eat. But my legs refused to move and my body was frozen and paralyzed with both fear and disgust. The orange markings were a lifeline, a trail leading me back to the surface. My legs ached, but the relief of being out of that hellish clearing, the noise of the feast growing more distant with each step, made my pulse steady a little. I pushed the door open. When my best friend Jake 3 and I started the Adventure 3, it was all for fun. They were dirty, grime was smeared on their skin, their clothes ragged, some in nothing more than tattered scraps of fabric, others in what looked like makeshift clothes, pieced together from whatever they could find in the tunnels. Some had bandages wrapped around their arms and heads, in the tunnels. And they were. I opened my mouth to argue but Jake 3 was already moving and stepping forward. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop him, to pull him back, but I couldn't. Something about his conviction pulled me, and even though every instinct was telling me to run the hell out of there, I paused for a moment, before following him further into the subway 3s. At first, it was so faint that I thought that I might have imagined it. "We need to leave, man," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I meant. Still, I knew that I couldn't stay. If I waited too long and if I kept looking for him, it would draw attention to myself. It wasn't just any vomit, it was thick, putrid and oily, like something from a nightmare. I threw up everywhere, all over the ground, the reek of rotten bile filling the air. I tore into the rat. The meat was cold and rubbery, its flesh stringy and tough. As I sat on the bed, it creaked under my weight. We kept pushing further. The dining room was small with a long wooden table in the center. Jake 3 must have left already. We kept moving, drawn by the hope of capturing something for the video, but I felt my nerves increasing with every step. The rats had all but disappeared also, like even they knew to avoid this area. I heard Jake 3 mutter beside me. He wasn't even trying to hide the awe in his voice. It was voices. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I took in the scene. And then I saw it, the leader standing on his makeshift platform staring down at the chaos unfolding below. The glass and jagged rat bones in his crown seemed to gleam in the dim light. Frank fell to his knees before it, holding up a bowl filled with something thick and red. Frank and his family were heading out into the yard, moving in a single file line toward the barn. The two younger children, Billy and Ruth, followed behind, their misshapen heads bobbing as they walked. And then, through my blurred vision, through the tears that blurred my sight, I saw him. A man kneeling beside me, staring directly at me with an unblinking, curious look in his eyes. I showed them the GoPro footage, hoping that they would take it seriously. The beam caught it instantly, casting a light on a line of severed rat heads stretched out across the floor in front of us. Each one was cleanly cut, like they had been sliced off with a blade, neat and precise, the way a cook might prepare a fresh chicken. We pushed forward, each step in sync now. As we approached the source of the noise, the voices grew clearer, louder, and yet still completely unintelligible, a garbled blend of human sound. Stay close, I murmured, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. We rounded a corner and the source of the noise came into view. I froze, my flashlight flickered in the dim light, and I nearly dropped it. We had entered a massive clearing in the middle of the Subway 3 system. It was like some kind of underground hub, a junction, a place where several tunnels converged, creating a central location. There were dozens, no hundreds of people. The thick layers of mold were replaced with smooth concrete. It looked as though this area of the Subway 3 was more maintained than the rest of it. I glanced at Jake 3, wondering if he was noticing it too. The meat was tough, its texture stringy and oily, and the taste was metallic. I forced it down, feeling bile rise up in my throat. I made my way to the window, peering through the thin curtains. No one was paying attention. Just then, passing by an intersection of tunnels, my flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating something. The tunnels felt more structured now, the paths straightening, and the walls narrowing just slightly, giving the whole space a more controlled and less abandoned feel. If I faltered for even a second, I knew that I would be exposed. "Tonight we bring you an offering," John and Mary said in unison. Sue clucked her tongue sympathetically. My flashlight cast weak beams of light on the wet surface, and for a brief moment, it felt like I was back in the world that I knew, safe. I moved faster now, the echo of my footsteps ringing in the silence of the tunnel. Where was Jake 3? Relief started to creep in as soon as I saw the familiar grimy walls of the tunnel again. My teeth sunk into it, but the texture was wrong, so wrong. "Well, I ain't no toe man, but I reckon that I can help. I live just up the road, got some tools back at the farm. You can stay the night and we'll see about fixing your car in the morning." I hesitated. The offer set off alarms in my head, but what other choice did I have? My legs already ached and my stomach was empty. Making the walk back to my car didn't seem like an option. "All right," I said finally. A hunger to know what was just beyond that next bend. We were now standing in the crowd. People don't jest. I've never seen him again, and I know now with a sickening certainty that he either got discovered by them and met a terrible fate, or arguably worse, he's still down there, trapped, forced to join them, that he's now one of them. When I got the call about my father's death, I decided to drive straight across the country to the funeral. "Thank you," I said, shaking her hand. I sat on the cold and damp floor, holding the rat in my lap, my hands shaking as I tried to force myself to calm down. I could hear their breathing, it was heavy and labored, and the low guttural muttering as they moved past us. Some had bandages wrapped around their arms and heads. Their dead eyes stared up blankly, for still glistening with damp, white rows of teeth that gaped out of tiny mouths in frozen agony. Think about it, man. I felt my pulse race as if we were on the verge of discovering something huge. Something we were never supposed to find. I slammed the truck into gear and I tore off down the road, the tires kicking up dust as I sped away from that cursed place. No, I must have been mistaken. An awkward moment of silence passed as I was stuck in my thoughts. "Nice to meet you all, thanks for having me," I forced out. "Kid here has some car troubles." I told him that he could stay with us for the night, Frank told Sue. The walls, which had been slick with grime and mildew just moments before, began to appear oddly cleaner. These people, if they could even be called that anymore, were standing in this cavernous space. They never gave it back to me. My stomach started to twist and churn. He wore a crown, something pieced together from what I assumed were rat bones, broken shards of glass and bits of trash from the Subway 3. I cut myself off, my words getting tangled. They wanted the extreme, the more hidden parts of NYC. It was Jake 3's idea to investigate these Subway 3 people. Rumor. He muttered something under his breath, a chant that I couldn't understand. The creature leaned forward, dipping its monstrous head toward the bowl, lapping at the thick red liquid with a long black tongue. And that's when I heard the door creak open down the hallway. I froze, listening as footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved down the hallway. From the top of its skull protruded massive curved horns, slick with some kind of dark liquid that dripped onto the altar below. The food sat like a stone in my stomach. They looked wrong, hunched over, disjointed. But I held onto it tightly, trying to ignore the disgust that bubbled up in my throat. Up close, the pile of rats was even more massive than I thought. Yeah, broke down a couple of miles up the road, no service either. There was something disturbingly ritualistic about their movement, a strange silent procession under the moonlight. When I went back to the station to check in, they acted like they had no idea who I was. They denied ever having talked to me, denied ever seeing the footage. They clung to their mother's dress, their eyes wide and unblinking. Frank ushered me inside before I had time to dwell on it. I looked around, hoping, praying that Jake 3 had managed to make it out before me, but there was no sign of him. Jake 3, that's insane. We stepped out of the truck. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling off in places. Slick with some kind of dark liquid that dripped onto the altar below. On top of its head was a large crude crown made of sticks and vine. My heart raced as the crowd shifted, pushing me closer to the rats. He had a calm, distant look in his eyes, as though he had been waiting for someone for a long time. "Car trouble, I take it?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. I felt the crowd pushing me forward, and before I could even think about what I was doing, I was right there standing at the edge of the pile. The rats were piled high, some of them twitching, others limp, their bodies cold and stiff. The scent of death hung thick in the air. A noxious mix of decaying rot that clung to the back of my throat. I had no choice. We actually found something right. This is what we came for. I got up quietly listening when I heard the front door open. But it wasn't the family that made my blood run cold. That was the plan. I couldn't deny the appeal. Rumors had circulated for decades about the shadowy figures who lurked below New York, scavenging, surviving off rats, and whatever the city had discarded. "That there's my wife Sue," Frank said, "and our kids, John and Mary, and their little ones, Billy and Ruth." I was confused for a moment at the way that he introduced them. "John and Mary's little ones, do you mean?" "Our king, tonight we bring you an offering," John and Mary said in unison. Frank said, his smile never fading. I pushed harder and harder until the light hit my face, and I crawled out into the daylight, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. My stomach lurched and bile rose in my throat. The rat that I had eaten, the taste, the texture, the sickening act of it came rushing back. I threw up everywhere, all over the ground. The reek of act of it came rushing back. The moment felt endless. "I'll be out of here tomorrow," I reminded myself. When I reached the edge of the crowd, I crouched down just like everyone else.